She stood at the courthouse steps in a dress she had bought on clearance, holding a bouquet of flowers her mother had picked up from a gas station on the way over, and she told herself the same thing she had been telling herself for 3 weeks. That it was just paperwork, that it didn't have to mean anything, that she was doing this for her family, and that doing something for the people you love, even when it costs you everything, is not weakness. It is the quiet, unglamorous kind of love that never makes it into movies. She walked through those doors, signed her name next to his, and became the wife of a man the world had already decided was nothing. What she did not know, what she could not have known standing there in that clearance dress with those gas station flowers, was that she had just married one of the wealthiest men in the country, and he had been waiting, patiently and deliberately, for exactly this moment. Before we go any further into this story, take a second right now and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from our community all across the country and around the world. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's get into this story, because it is one of the most extraordinary things I have ever had the privilege of telling. The story of Caroline Merritt and James Caldwell begins not at the courthouse and not at the altar, but in a small hardware and supply store on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, in the early 1980s, when a man named Walter Merritt built something from nothing using his hands and his stubbornness and an almost religious belief that honest work, done consistently and without complaint, was its own form of dignity. Walter Merritt was not an educated man in the formal sense. He had not gone to college. He had grown up in a working-class household where money was discussed in hushed tones, and the word debt carried the same moral weight as a character failing. But he knew how to work, and he knew how to treat people, and over the course of 30 years he turned that small supply store into a regional institution, a business with 3 locations, a loyal customer base, and a reputation in Columbus that meant something. By the time Caroline was born, the youngest of Walter's 3 children, the Merritt name in their part of the city stood for something. It was not wealth, exactly. It was the kind of standing that comes from being known as someone who doesn't cut corners, who pays his debts on time, who shows up. And Caroline grew up understanding, in the way that children absorb the values of the households they are raised in without ever being explicitly taught them, that the Merritt name was worth protecting. She was, by every account from the people who knew her through her childhood and young adulthood, exactly the kind of daughter that a man like Walter Merritt would produce. She was practical. She was careful. She had her father's stubbornness and her mother's emotional intelligence, and she combined those 2 things into a personality that was simultaneously warm and impossible to push around. She studied business at Ohio State, graduated without fanfare but with genuine competence, and went to work in the accounting division of a regional manufacturing company in Columbus, where her supervisors quickly recognized that she had a rare ability to look at a set of numbers and immediately understand not just what they said, but what they meant. She was good at her job. She was promoted twice in 4 years. She had a small apartment, a group of close friends, and a life that was modest but genuinely her own, built on her own terms, through her own effort, without anyone handing her anything. James Caldwell was born in 1965 in Cincinnati, Ohio, the only child of a postal worker named Earl Caldwell and a woman named Dorothy, who worked as a seamstress out of the back bedroom of their house on Vine Street. There was no money in that house, but there was something else, an atmosphere of fierce and unapologetic ambition that Dorothy Caldwell maintained with the focused intensity of a woman who had decided, sometime before James was old enough to understand what decisions were, that her son was going to be different. Dorothy read to James every night. She took him to the public library every Saturday morning. She corrected his grammar at the dinner table not with cruelty, but with the patient, relentless insistence of someone who understood that language was a door, and that the people who had been told they didn't belong on the other side of it needed to be taught how to pick the lock. James Caldwell grew up understanding that the world expected very little from a black kid from Vine Street in Cincinnati, and that this expectation was not a limitation, it was an opportunity. Because when people expect nothing from you, they are not watching carefully. And a person who is not being watched carefully can move very fast. By his mid-20s, James had moved to Columbus, taken a series of jobs in finance and investment analysis, and begun developing a reputation in certain circles as someone with an almost preternatural ability to evaluate distressed assets. He could look at a failing business, A company with a bad balance sheet, a damaged reputation, a management team that had lost its nerve, and see through the surface damage to the underlying value. He saw what others missed, or rather, he saw what others chose not to see, because looking past surface damage requires a tolerance for complexity and a willingness to sit with uncertainty that most people in comfortable positions simply do not bother to develop. James had developed it because James had never been in a comfortable position. He had learned to see value in things the world had written off because he understood, personally and intimately, what it felt like to be written off. By 1993, James Caldwell had formed a private investment partnership with two colleagues and was quietly acquiring undervalued businesses in the Midwest, a small logistics company here, a struggling regional distributor there, a manufacturing operation in Cleveland that everyone else had passed on because it looked, on paper, like a dead end. He turned them around, one by one, with a discipline and a patience that his partners occasionally found maddening, but ultimately respected. He took broken things and made them work. By 1997, the partnership had assets under management that placed it, by any objective measure, among the more significant private equity operations in the region. James Caldwell was 32 years old and worth, by conservative estimate, somewhere in the range of $40 million. Almost no one outside a very specific professional circle had ever heard his name. And then came 1999, and the federal indictment. And the moment when everything James Caldwell had built with 12 years of discipline and precision and sacrifice was stripped away in a process so swift and so brutal and so complete that people who watched it happen still speak about it with a kind of disbelief, as though they are describing a natural disaster rather than a legal proceeding. The charges were federal securities fraud, specifically, allegations that James and one of his partners had manipulated the reported performance of a fund in order to attract institutional investors, presenting returns that were, according to prosecutors, materially misrepresented. James maintained from the first day of the investigation to the last day of his sentence that he had not known what his partner was doing, that the misrepresentations had been made without his knowledge and had been discovered by him only after the investors had already committed their capital. His partner, a man named Gregory Ashford who had grown up wealthy and knew how to conduct himself in a courtroom in the particular way that wealth teaches, took a plea deal that significantly reduced his own exposure. James went to trial. James lost. James received a sentence of 54 months in a federal correctional facility in Terre Haute, Indiana. The financial press, which had barely noticed James Caldwell when he was building something, noticed him extensively when he was being destroyed. The coverage was not kind, and it was not particularly interested in nuance. The story of a black financier from Cincinnati going to federal prison for securities fraud fit into a narrative framework that required very little original thought to construct, and the people constructing it largely did not bother with original thought. What they did not write about, because they did not know it and would not have considered it particularly newsworthy if they had, was what James Caldwell did in the 18 months between the indictment and his surrender to custody. He restructured, quietly, carefully, through a series of legal instruments and holding arrangements that his attorneys had constructed with the specific purpose of preserving what could be preserved. James moved the core of his financial interests into structures that the government's asset forfeiture process could not easily reach. Not all of it. He lost a great deal, but not everything. And what he retained, placed in the hands of people he trusted with the kind of trust that only comes from years of direct experience and deliberate testing, continued to operate while James Caldwell served his time in Terre Haute, and the world assumed he was finished. He was not finished. But you have to understand what 54 months in a federal facility does to a person before you can understand what James Caldwell came out of it as. It is not simply the time, though time, in that context, is not an abstraction. It is the specific, daily experience of being in a place designed to communicate, through every physical and institutional detail, that you are not a person who matters. The food, the light, the noise, the rules that exist for the sake of rules, the interactions with people who have been given authority over your most basic movements and who exercise that authority with varying degrees of humanity. All of it adds up to a sustained pressure on the self that either breaks a person or refines them in ways that nothing outside those walls could have produced. James Caldwell was not broken. What came out of Terre Haute in the spring of 2004? blinking in the Indiana sunlight with a cardboard box and a bus ticket and 54 months of compressed and concentrated clarity, was not the same man who had walked in. It was something leaner, something that had burned away everything unnecessary and kept only what was essential. He knew exactly who he was. He knew exactly what he wanted. And he knew, with a patience that had been built out of circumstances most people will never face, that he had time. Walter Merritt did not know who James Caldwell was in the spring of 2004. Walter was 61 years old and running a supply business that had, over the preceding 4 years, developed a set of financial problems that he could not discuss with his children without crying. The regional expansion he had attempted in the late 1990s had been badly timed, colliding first with the economic disruption of 2001, and then with the emergence of 2 national chain competitors who moved into the Columbus market with the kind of pricing power that a family business simply cannot compete with on equal terms. Walter had borrowed to fund the expansion. The loans had been manageable when the business was performing as projected. When the performance fell short of projections, the debt did not become more forgiving. Walter Merritt, by 2003, was servicing a debt load that was consuming the margins of a business that had been his life's work, and he was doing it quietly, without telling his children how serious the situation had become, because Walter Merritt was a man of a generation and a temperament that did not ask for help. Caroline found out the way adult children often find out about things their parents have been protecting them from, not in a direct conversation, but sideways, through a detail that didn't make sense and led, when she pulled on it with the instincts of someone who read financial statements for a living, to a reality far more serious than anything she had imagined. She found a second mortgage filing in her father's name on the family home. She ran the numbers. She sat with the numbers for 3 days before she said anything. And then she sat across from her father at the kitchen table where she had done her homework as a child, and she asked him, as calmly as she could manage, to tell her everything. Walter Merritt, who had not cried in front of his children since their mother's funeral 8 years earlier, cried. And Caroline understood, in that kitchen, that the problem was larger than she had anticipated and that she was the only one in the family equipped to do something about it. She spent the following 6 months attempting to restructure the debt through conventional channels, refinancing, negotiating with creditors, exploring the possibility of a partial sale of one of the locations. She was methodical and she was persistent, and she was, ultimately, unsuccessful because the financial environment of 2003 and 2004 was not generous to small business owners attempting to restructure legacy debt, and because the terms of Walter's original loans contained provisions that limited his options in ways that a less sophisticated borrower would not have fully understood when he signed. By early 2005, one of Walter's primary creditors, a commercial lending entity that had itself changed hands twice since originating the loan, had issued a notice of default and initiated proceedings that, if allowed to run their course, would result in the forced liquidation of the Merritt supply business and the lien on the family home being called. 30 years of Walter Merritt's life. Gone. Unless someone intervened. The intervention came in a form that Caroline did not expect and could not, at first, make sense of. A lawyer appeared. Not one of the collection attorneys representing the creditor. A different lawyer, sharp and quiet, and carrying a brief that outlined a proposal she had never encountered in any professional context. The creditor, the letter explained, had transferred Walter Merritt's debt to a private holding entity. The holding entity was prepared to offer complete forgiveness of the outstanding balance, release of the lien on the family home, and a 5-year operational support arrangement for the Merritt supply business. The consideration requested in exchange was not financial. It was personal. The principal of the holding entity, a private investor who wished, at this stage, to remain unidentified, was requesting the hand of Caroline Merritt in marriage. She read that letter 4 times. She called the lawyer and asked him to repeat what he had just told her in plain language. He did. She asked if this was some kind of joke. He said it was not. She asked who, specifically, had sent this proposal. He told her he was not authorized to disclose the identity of his client at this stage. She told him what she thought of that, in terms that a man who had spent his career in corporate law was not entirely accustomed to hearing. She hung up. She sat in her apartment for a long time. And then she called her father, and she told him, and Walter Merritt, who had built his reputation on not asking his daughter for anything, said nothing for so long that she thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, all he said was, "Caroline, I can't ask you to do this." And the way he said it, the specific weight in his voice, the weight of a proud man who has run out of roads, told her everything she needed to know about how desperate the situation actually was. She said yes. She said yes not because she was naive, not because she had any romantic feeling toward a man she had never met, and not because she believed, on some level, that things would work out the way they do in stories. She said yes because she was her father's daughter, and her father's work, and her father's name, and 30 years of honest labor were sitting on the edge of erasure, and she was the only person in a position to stop it. She said yes with her eyes open and her heart closed, and a set of conditions that she delivered through that same quiet lawyer. She would go through with the marriage on the condition that she retained her own financial independence, that the arrangement be treated with dignity, and that if the marriage proved to be genuinely unworkable, there would be a clear and equitable exit path. The lawyer took her conditions to his client. The conditions were accepted without modification, not negotiated, not pushed back against. Accepted, in their entirety, the same day they were submitted. That detail stayed with Caroline. A man of means, in her experience, does not simply accept conditions that limit his options. He negotiates. He tests the boundaries. He finds out where you will give ground. The fact that this man, whoever he was, had accepted her terms without a single revision told her something she filed away without yet knowing what to do with. It told her that whoever was on the other side of this arrangement had thought about it very carefully, had expected her to have conditions, and had decided, before she even raised them, that they were reasonable. She met James Caldwell for the first time in the lobby of a downtown Columbus hotel, 1 week before the courthouse ceremony. He was taller than she had expected, quieter than she had expected, and looked at her with a directness that she found unsettling in a way she could not immediately categorize. He was not what she had constructed in her imagination during the weeks of waiting. She had imagined, in the various versions of this encounter she had run through her mind, someone aggressive, or someone obviously damaged, or someone with the particular quality of men who are accustomed to purchasing what they want, a consumer's relationship with the world that announces itself in small ways. James had none of that. What he had, sitting across from her in that hotel lobby in a jacket that was expensive but not ostentatious, was a kind of composed and watchful stillness that reminded her, of all things, of the best attorneys she had worked with. People who listened more than they spoke because they understood that listening was where the information was. They talked for 2 hours. He asked her questions about her work, her father's business, what she valued in her professional life. He did not ask personal questions. He did not explain himself at length. When she asked him, directly, why he was doing this, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "I know what your father's business means to him. I know what it took to build it. I wanted it to continue." She asked him how he knew about Walter Merritt. He said he had been aware of the Merritt family for some time. She asked him what that meant. He said he would explain it fully, in time. She did not push further, partly because something in his manner told her that pushing would not produce the answer faster, and partly because she was exhausted and the courthouse was a week away and the thing was going to happen regardless of what she understood about his motivations. She walked out of that hotel into the Columbus afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing, and thought, "This is either going to be one of the worst decisions I have ever made, or it is going to be something I cannot yet put a name to." She did not yet know which. The ceremony was everything the word courthouse implies: fluorescent lighting, laminate furniture, a clerk who had clearly performed the ritual more times than he could count and had calibrated his warmth accordingly. Caroline's father was there, her 2 brothers, and a woman she would later learn was James's attorney. No family of James's. No friends. When she asked him about that, quietly, before they were called in, he said his mother had passed away 6 years earlier and that he had spent the past 5 years in circumstances that had made social relationships difficult to maintain. She did not ask him to elaborate. The clerk read the words. They signed the documents. James Caldwell placed a ring on her finger that she would later have appraised, in a moment of suspicion, and discover was worth more than her car. They walked out into the same Columbus afternoon, and her father shook James's hand with the expression of a man who does not quite know how to hold all the things he is feeling at once. And James told Walter Merritt, and this is something Caroline has described in every interview she has given since. James told her father, Your store will be fine. You built something worth protecting." And Walter Merritt, who did not cry at weddings, cried. The early months of the marriage were, as Caroline later described them, the strangest period of her adult life, not because of conflict, which she had prepared herself for, and not because of anything overtly difficult, but because of the quality of the silence that lived between two people who did not yet know how to be in the same space. They lived in a house in a quiet part of Columbus, not the kind of house that announced wealth, but the kind that whispered it in the details, in the quality of the materials, in the way the rooms were arranged with a precision that suggested someone had thought carefully about how light moved through them at different times of day. James was frequently away. When he was home, he was considerate and quiet, and kept to himself in ways that felt less like coldness and more like a deeply established habit of self-containment. He did not ask much of her. He did not intrude on her work, her friendships, her routines. He cooked, occasionally, and the food was very good, which she found inexplicably disorienting. She noticed things. That was her nature. The nature of a woman who had spent her professional life reading between the lines of financial documents. And she could not simply turn it off at home. She noticed that James received calls at odd hours from people who identified themselves only by first name. She noticed that the house ran, without any apparent effort on anyone's part, in a way that suggested resources she could not account for on the basis of anything she had been told about his financial situation. She noticed that the one room in the house she had never been invited into, the study at the end of the upstairs hallway, which James kept locked, received a steady stream of couriered documents. Small things, individually. But Caroline Merritt was not a person who looked at data points individually. She looked at patterns. And the patterns she was assembling, piece by careful piece, in the first months of her marriage, did not match the story she had been given about the man she had married. The moment of real rupture came 7 months into the marriage, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday evening, when a business publication that Caroline subscribed to digitally published a profile of a private equity firm based in Indianapolis. The profile was not about James Caldwell. It was about the firm's investment strategy, its portfolio, its approach to acquiring distressed manufacturing businesses in the Midwest and turning them around for institutional investors. It was a detailed and well-reported piece, and Caroline read it with the professional attention she brought to everything in her field, and she was 3/4 of the way through it when she stopped and read a paragraph again, and then read it a third time. The article, in describing the historical roots of the firm's investment philosophy, referenced a series of landmark turnaround transactions from the mid to late 1990s, transactions that the author described as foundational to the current firm's approach. The transactions were attributed, in a single subordinate clause that the author clearly considered a minor historical footnote, to the early work of a Columbus-based investor who had subsequently exited the industry under adverse circumstances. No name was given, but the transactions described, the specific companies, the specific strategies, the specific timeline, matched, with a precision that Caroline could not dismiss, everything she had been able to piece together about James Caldwell's career before his conviction. She sat with her laptop in the kitchen of the house where she had been living for 7 months as the wife of a man she believed she mostly did not know, and she began to do what she did best. She researched, not casually and not quickly, with the systematic, documentation-anchored thoroughness of a professional who understands that the only conclusions worth trusting are the ones you can trace, step by step, back to verifiable sources. She started with the public record of James's conviction, the court documents, which were a matter of public record and which she realized with a start, never actually read in full. She had known he was a convicted felon. She had not, until that Tuesday evening, known the specifics of what he had built before the conviction or the precise arguments that had been made, on both sides, about his culpability. She read the full trial record. She read the appellate filing. She read, with increasing and focused attention, the dissenting analysis from one of the expert witnesses for the defense, a forensic accountant who had argued, in language that Caroline found both technically rigorous and genuinely persuasive, that the evidence did not support a finding of knowing participation in the fraudulent reporting, and that the transactions most central to the prosecution's theory of culpability had been structured and executed by James's partner, Gregory Ashford, in ways that James would not have had full visibility into from his position in the partnership. She was awake until 4 in the morning. And when she finally closed her laptop and sat in the quiet kitchen with the Columbus night pressing against the windows, what she felt was not the confirmation of suspicion, which is its own kind of relief, but something more disorienting. Something that required her to revisit, carefully and honestly, every assumption she had been carrying about the man asleep down the hall. She found the first holding company on a Thursday. She found the second and third the following Monday. She found the fifth and sixth by the end of the week after that. Each discovery opened into a new layer, and each new layer was larger than the one before it. And by the time Caroline Merritt had followed the chain of holding entities and trust structures and subsidiary relationships as far as she could go with the public records available to her, she was sitting in front of a number that she double-checked and then triple-checked and then sat within complete silence for a very long time. Because the number was not a surprise exactly. She had been watching it grow for 2 weeks, but seeing it fully assembled was still, in the specific and unambiguous way of certain truths, a shock. James Caldwell, the ex-convict she had married in a courthouse for $300 in filing fees, was worth, by the most conservative reading of the documentation she had assembled, somewhere between $800 million and $1.2 billion. The range existed because some of the structures were deliberately opaque. The floor of the range was not. She did not confront him that evening. She did not confront him the next day. She sat with what she knew for 3 full days, and she thought about it from every angle available to her. And she asked herself the question that any honest person in her position would have to ask. Why? Not why was he wealthy, and not why had he hidden it. Those questions had answers she could construct plausibly enough. But why her? Why had James Caldwell, a man with essentially unlimited resources and the kind of patient intelligence that she was now understanding more fully with every passing day, chosen this specific and elaborate method of entering her life? Because it was not random. Nothing about this was random. The acquisition of her father's debt, the proposal, the conditions she had set that he had accepted without negotiation, the house, the locked study, the couriered documents, none of it was improvised. It was constructed. She wanted to understand what it was constructed for. She walked into the study on a Sunday morning when James was home. The door was unlocked, something she registered as she reached for the handle, as possibly intentional. The room was orderly in the way that working spaces belonging to organized minds tend to be, not sparse, but structured, everything in a relationship to everything else that reflected a system. There were bookshelves. There was a desk. There was, on the left wall, a corkboard. And on the corkboard, in a configuration that she took in and then stood in front of for a very long time, were documents and photographs and printed records that she recognized. Not all of them, but enough. Reports on the Merritt Supply business going back 5 years. Articles about Columbus commercial real estate. A photograph of her father shaking hands with someone outside the original store location, taken from an angle that suggested it had been taken without Walter's awareness. And in the center of the board, a single index card with a date written on it in neat block letters. A date that was, Caroline calculated as she stood there, approximately 2 years before James's release from Terre, Haute. James was in the doorway behind her. She had not heard him come up the stairs. She did not turn around. She asked, without turning around, the question she had been shaping for 3 days. How long have you been planning this? James Caldwell, who had spent 54 months in a federal facility developing the particular patience of a man who has learned that the right answer delivered at the wrong moment is worse than no answer at all, said, "Longer than I should probably admit to." She turned around then, and he told her. What James told Caroline on that Sunday morning in the study is something she has described in fragments across multiple interviews and a long profile piece, never all at once. Always with the specific selectiveness of a person who understands that some portions of a private conversation belong to the 2 people who had it. But the architecture of what he told her has been established clearly enough to reconstruct. James had known Walter Merritt's name before he went to prison. Not personally, they had never met. But Walter had, years earlier, written a letter to the editor of a Columbus business journal, responding to a piece that had been published about the wave of federal indictments targeting black financiers in the late 1990s. The letter was not long, and it was not written by a man with any financial stake in the matter. Walter Merritt had no connection to the cases being discussed and nothing to gain from weighing in. But he had weighed in anyway, with the plain-spoken directness of a man who calls things what they are, and what he had called this particular thing was a pattern and a problem, and something that the business community he was part of should be willing to name out loud instead of pretending not to see. James had read that letter in the period between his indictment and his trial, in a period when he was reading a great deal because reading was one of the few things that kept the walls from closing in, and it had stayed with him in the specific way that evidence of unexpected decency tends to stay with a person who is being confronted simultaneously with the worst of what people are capable of. In Terre, Haute, James had time to think, more time than any person would choose to have. And in that time, he had done two things simultaneously. He had worked through every legal channel available to him on the business structures that would preserve what he had built, and he had thought, with the careful and methodical quality that defined everything else he did, about what he wanted his life to be when he came out. Not just financially, structurally. He had been betrayed by someone he had trusted with everything. He had watched that betrayal play out in a public forum while the system worked through its process, and he had emerged from that process with a conviction that he believed was unjust and a clarity about what he valued in people that he had not possessed before. He valued integrity in a way that he could now define specifically because he had seen its absence operate at close range and understood precisely what it cost. He valued the kind of decency that shows up when it has no incentive to. The letter-writing decency of a hardware store owner with no connection to the case, who simply thought something was wrong and said so. He had kept track of Walter Merritt for years. Not obsessively, but the way a person keeps track of something they consider important and don't want to lose sight of. When Walter's business difficulties became visible in public filings, James had been watching. When the debt situation developed in the way that debt situations develop when a small business is fighting against structural forces it cannot match, James had seen an opportunity, not to exploit, but to repay. Walter's letter had cost him nothing and possibly meant nothing to Walter himself. To James it had been, in a dark period, a reminder that not everyone who called themselves part of a community was willing to pretend not to see what was in front of them. That deserved something. James had decided, in the particular and unconventional way that his mind worked, that it deserved this. Not simply the debt forgiven. Something real. Something that would make Walter Merritt's work continue and give the man's family a foundation that debt and bad timing could not erode. The daughter was not incidental to the plan. She was central to it, and James explained why with a directness that Caroline did not expect, and which, later, she would describe as the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. He had researched her, not because he was looking for a wife in the conventional sense, but because he was looking for a partner in the fullest possible meaning of that word, someone he could trust with what he had built, someone whose ethical record he could verify independently of what they said about themselves, someone who had demonstrated, in the specific and documentable way that professional lives document character, that she was who she appeared to be. Caroline's career record, the promotions, the internal audit she had flagged at personal professional risk, the reputation she had built with colleagues and supervisors, had told him what he needed to know. The conditions she had set for the marriage had confirmed it. A woman without integrity takes what she can get. A woman with integrity sets conditions. Caroline had set conditions. He looked at her across that study on that Sunday morning, and he said, "I wasn't looking for a transaction. I was looking for someone I could trust. And I needed to know, before I trusted anyone again, that the trust was warranted." Caroline stood there in the study of a house she now understood she had barely begun to know, in a marriage she had entered as a sacrifice and was now looking at from a completely different angle, and she felt a complicated collection of things that she has never fully reduced to a single description. She felt, she has said, furious at the manipulation of the situation, at the information she had been denied, at the presumption that his method was acceptable regardless of his intentions. She felt, simultaneously, something that she is careful to describe accurately, which is not romantic feeling, not yet, but a recognition. A recognition of a mind she respected, operating on values she understood, expressing them in a way that was deeply strange but not, when she examined it carefully, entirely unreasonable. She did not forgive him that morning. She told him she needed time. She told him that what he had done, regardless of why, had removed her ability to make a fully informed decision about her own life, and that this was not something she was going to process quickly or gracefully or without anger. James Caldwell nodded. He said, I know that, and I'll wait. He said it with the specific quality of a man who has learned, in the hardest possible circumstances, what waiting actually means. She walked out of the study. She went downstairs. She made coffee. And she sat at the kitchen table in the quiet Columbus morning and thought about the fact that the man she had married to save her father's hardware store was one of the wealthiest people she had ever met, had known about her family for years before she knew he existed, and had, in the most elaborate and arguably most presumptuous act of gratitude she had ever encountered, arranged an entire life event around a letter he had read in a newspaper while awaiting trial. The months that followed the conversation in the study were not simple, and anyone who suggests that a revelation of this magnitude resolves itself cleanly into a love story has not thought carefully about what it actually means to discover that the fundamental premise of a relationship you are living inside was constructed without your full knowledge. Caroline worked through it the way she worked through everything, systematically, honestly, without shortcuts. She asked James questions and he answered them, fully and without defensiveness, which she had not entirely expected. She asked about his conviction, about Gregory Ashford, about what had actually happened in the fund. She asked about the holding companies, about the businesses they controlled, about what his plans were for the capital he had preserved. She asked about his mother, about Vine Street in Cincinnati, about what Dorothy Caldwell had been like. She asked about Terre Haute, what it had been, what it had done to him, what he had thought about in the long stretches of time when there was nothing to do but think. James answered all of it. He answered it in the way that people answer questions when they have nothing left to lose by honesty and a great deal to gain by it. She began, gradually, to see the full shape of who she had married. Not the shape that had been visible from the outside. Not the ex-convict, not the hidden billionaire, not the elaborate planner, but the actual person underneath all of those descriptions. A man who had grown up on Vine Street understanding that the world would not give him what it gave other people and had decided, very early, that this was acceptable, that he would build what he needed without waiting for permission. A man whose mother had read to him every Saturday at the public library and had made him understand that language was a door. A man who had been betrayed at the peak of his success by someone he had trusted and had sat in a federal facility for 54 months processing that betrayal until he understood it completely. Understood it not just as a wrong done to him, but as a lesson about what vigilance costs when you abandon it. A man who had read a hardware store owner's letter about decency in a business journal and had carried it, literally, as a folded piece of paper in the pocket of the jacket he wore to every court hearing. That detail she found out 3 months after the study conversation, when James produced the letter, the original, folded along the same creases it had accumulated over 15 years, the newsprint yellowed and soft at the edges, Walter Merritt's name in the byline above, 3 paragraphs about fairness and community and the responsibility of people with standing to speak when they see something wrong. James had carried it through the trial, through sentencing, through processing into Terre Haute. He had kept it in a shoebox under the bed allocated to him in the facility at Terre Haute for 54 months. He had carried it out when he left. Caroline held it in her hands and read it. Her father's words, written before she was old enough to understand what they meant, preserved by a man she had not known existed, and something shifted in her that she has said she could not precisely name, but has never been confused about the significance of. Walter Merritt found out the full truth about James Caldwell on a Saturday afternoon at the Merritt family home, when Caroline and James came together and told him everything. Caroline has described the experience of watching her father receive that information as one of the most extraordinary moments of her life. Walter Merritt was 62 years old, a practical man who had built his life on transactions he understood, and he sat at his kitchen table while his daughter and her husband explained what had been happening and what James had preserved, and his face went through a sequence of expressions that Caroline counted and has described as confusion, then disbelief, then a specific stillness that she recognized as her father processing something too large for immediate response. Then, when James produced the folded letter, something that she has never been able to describe more precisely than to say that it looked like a man being handed something he had given away a long time ago, and had not expected to see again. Walter took the letter. He read it. He set it down on the kitchen table, and he looked at James Caldwell for a long time. And then he said something that has become, in the telling and retelling of this story, the moment that most people describe as the one that stays with them. Walter said, "I don't remember writing this. I've written a lot of letters, but I know I meant every word of it. And I want you to know, whatever you've done for my family, whatever this has all been, you didn't owe me anything for that. A man does the right thing because it's the right thing to do. That's not a bill you get to collect on." James Caldwell, who had spent years planning the repayment of a debt the creditor did not know existed, sat across the kitchen table from Walter Merritt and said, "I know. That's why I wanted to." The story of Caroline and James Caldwell in the decade following that kitchen table conversation is a story that requires its own telling, and we will tell it in full in the continuation of this documentary. But what I want you to hold as we pause here is the shape of what this story is actually about, because it is not, at its core, about money, though the money is extraordinary. It is not about a forced marriage, though the marriage was genuinely forced in the ways that matter. It is about something harder to quantify. It is about what a letter written without expectation of return can set in motion. It is about what a man who has lost everything holds on to when the world has decided he is finished. It is about a woman who walked into a courthouse to save her father's hardware store and discovered, on the other side of a journey she had not chosen, that the story she was living was not the one she had been told. And it is about the specific and irreducible value of people who do the right thing when no one is watching and nothing is at stake. Because those people, even when they have no idea it is happening, change the lives of strangers in ways that ripple forward in time for longer than any of us can trace. Caroline Merritt Caldwell has said, in the years since this story became known, that the question she is asked most often is whether she is angry about what James did, about the information he withheld, about the architecture of the arrangement, about the presumption that his judgment about what she needed was more reliable than her own. She has said that she held that anger for a long time, that it was legitimate and she did not hurry it, and that what eventually replaced it was not forgiveness in the sense of excusing the method, but something more practical. The recognition that the man who had designed this arrangement had, at every step, treated her with more genuine respect than most people she had encountered in her professional life, had refused to impose himself on her beyond the terms she had set, had answered every question she had ever asked him with complete honesty, and had proven, in the long and unhurried way that character proves itself, to be exactly who the evidence suggested he was. She said, "I spent a long time being angry about the decision he made for me. And then I spent a long time being honest with myself about the fact that every decision he made, once I was actually in front of him, was mine." The Merritt supply stores are still open, all 3 locations. Walter Merritt retired at 67, having paid off every dollar of the debt that had nearly destroyed him, having watched his business stabilize and grow with the kind of operational support that James's network provided discreetly and without fanfare. The family home on the east side of Columbus is still in the family, and the Caldwell Foundation, established jointly by Caroline and James in 2009, has invested, to date, over $200 million in small business support and workforce development programs in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, programs that are designed, in the specific way that only a person who built something from nothing in Cincinnati and then had it taken away could design, to give people the resources to build things that cannot be taken away. What this story asks of you, and I mean this in the most direct way I know how to say it, is that you resist the shortcut of the first label. Ex-convict, billionaire, arranged marriage, forced choice. Every one of those labels is accurate. Not one of them, standing alone or even together, tells you what this story is actually about. The truth of what happened between Caroline Merritt and James Caldwell, between James Caldwell and Walter Merritt, between a letter written in good faith and a life rebuilt around it. That truth lives underneath the labels, in the long and quiet and unglamorous work of people who decided to be who they said they were and kept that decision even when it was expensive. That is harder to reduce to a headline, but it is the only part of this story that matters. I want to know what you are carrying away from this story. Drop it in the comments. Not a reaction, but a thought. Was there a moment in this story that changed how you were reading it? Was there a point where your assessment of James shifted, and if so, when and why? What do you make of the method he used, regardless of his intentions? These are not questions with clean answers, which is exactly why I am asking them, and exactly why I read every single comment this community leaves. This is the kind of story that deserves a real conversation. Come have it with us. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about what a single act of decency can set in motion, share this. You never know what letter you have already written that someone, somewhere, is still carrying. The next story in this series is coming soon, and it is one that will redefine, in ways I am not yet ready to preview fully, what you think you understand about loyalty and the lengths a person will go to protect the ones they love. Make sure you are subscribed. You do not want to arrive at that story in the middle,